Precisely 11:23 in the morning on September 17, 1944, Private First Class Eddie Kowalski found himself crouched inside the steel belly of an M4 Sherman tank on the outskirts of the small French village of Arracourt. The air inside the turret was already thick with smoke, sweat, and fear. Outside, the war had suddenly narrowed to a single terrifying moment. 400 yards ahead, a German Panzer IV had just rolled into view, its turret slowly rotating until the barrel pointed directly at Kowalski's tank. Everything that could go wrong already had. The Sherman's gunner was dead, slumped lifeless beside the breach. The commander, Lieutenant Carson, was badly wounded, blood soaking through the field, dressing pressed against his shoulder. And Eddie Kowalski wasn't even supposed to be in the gunner's seat. He was the loader, the man who passed shells, the man who followed orders, the man who had never fired the 75mm main gun in combat. Never aimed it under pressure, never trained for this moment. The Panzer fired first. The German shell screamed past the Sherman so close that the tank rocked violently sideways. The blast rattled Kowalski's teeth. His ears rang like church bells struck by hammers. He tasted copper as adrenaline flooded his mouth. The turret stank of burned propellant and blood. Lieutenant Carson lifted his head. Pain etched across his face. He looked directly at Kowalski and said a single word: "Shoot." Kowalski hesitated for half a heartbeat, then climbed into the gunner's seat. His hands trembled as he grabbed the controls. Through the periscope, he saw the Panzer crew reloading. Maybe 20 seconds before they fired again. 20 seconds before he died. Doctrine screamed in his head: aim for the lower hull, disable the tracks, immobilize the tank. But he couldn't see the lower hull. Trees blocked the view. All he could see was the Panzer's turret, thick sloped armor, designed to shrug off anything the Sherman could throw at it. Worse, the Sherman's gun sight wasn't meant for this distance. The sight was calibrated for engagements between 600 and 2,000 yards. The Panzer was only 400 yards away, too close. The sight wouldn't depress low enough. Kowalski would have to guess. He felt something under his boot. He looked down and saw a broken hand mirror lying on the turret floor, cracked straight down the middle. It had belonged to Corporal Hayes, their gunner. Hayes used it to shave, to check his teeth, for nothing military at all. Just a stupid mirror. The Panzer's barrel lowered. 10 seconds. Kowalski picked up the mirror. Kowalski didn't understand what he was doing at first. His vision tunneled as panic took over. His breathing turned shallow and fast. Almost without thinking, he held the broken mirror above the gun sight at an angle and looked through the optics. The battlefield suddenly changed. The mirror reflected the scene outside, but lower, much lower. Where the periscope couldn't see, the mirror could. Kowalski saw the Panzer's hull. He saw the driver's viewport. He saw the thin section of armor, where the steel was barely 50 millimeters thick. The Panzer fired again. The shell punched through the Sherman's front glacis plate and exited through the engine deck without detonating. A miracle. 3 inches higher and Kowalski would have been vaporized. He pressed the firing button. The Sherman's gun roared. Smoke filled the turret. The recoil slammed the tank backward. When the smoke cleared, the Panzer sat motionless. Thick black smoke poured from its hatch. One shot, one kill. Lieutenant Carson stared at Kowalski in disbelief. "What the hell did you just do?" Kowalski didn't answer. 2 more German tanks had appeared on the ridgeline, closer than the first, 300 yards. Both turrets turning, both guns loaded. The Battle of Arra had begun days earlier, but this was the moment it changed. American Shermans were not built for this fight. They were lighter, thinner, undergunned. German Panthers and Panzer IVs dominated long-range engagements. The statistics were brutal. 5 Shermans destroyed for every Panther killed. The problem wasn't courage, it was geometry. At close range, the Sherman's sight couldn't aim low enough. Tankers called it the dead zone. Too close to aim properly, too far to ram. If you entered it, you usually died. Kowalski raised the mirror again and broke the rules. The bomber dropped lower as the clouds thickened, and with every second, the sky ahead grew more hostile. The crew could feel it before they saw it. That invisible wall of fire every veteran feared. Flak bursts began as distant black dots, then suddenly bloomed into violent orange explosions. The aircraft shook as if struck by a giant's fist. Metal screamed somewhere along the fuselage. The pilot clenched the controls, fighting the instinct to climb. Climbing meant death. Staying low meant gambling with every gun on the ground. The navigator shouted corrections, his voice barely cutting through the roar of engines. Outside, the sky had turned into a maze of fire and smoke. A burst detonated close off the left wing, slamming the bomber sideways. The engineer yelled that oil pressure was dropping. Another hit punched through the skin, sending fragments spinning through the cabin. The smell of burning insulation filled the air. For a moment, no one spoke. Then enemy fighters appeared, dark shapes diving out of the clouds, moving too fast to count. The tail gunner opened fire, tracers carving bright lines through the darkness. One fighter pulled away at the last second, another pressed the attack. Machine gun rounds rattled against the bomber like hail. The crew had trained for this, but training never captured the terror of real combat. Hands shook, mouths went dry. Every man understood that this was the point of no return. Either they broke through the flak corridor, or the sky would swallow them whole. Dawn on September 18, 1944, arrived quietly over the fields near Arracourt. But inside Eddie Kowalski's Sherman, nothing felt calm. The steel hull was cold, damp with condensation, and scarred from the day before. Burn marks stained the turret walls. Spent shell casings lay where they had fallen. Outside, the blackened skeletons of 3 destroyed German tanks still smoked faintly in the distance. Kowalski sat in the gunner's seat again. The broken mirror rested in his hands. Was still cracked straight down the center, still held together with tape, still functional. At least he thought it was. He had slept barely an hour. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the Panzer's gun leveling toward him, heard Carson's voice saying, "Shoot," felt the recoil shaking his bones. The radio crackled. German armor reported moving east of Arracourt. Single contact, range unknown. Kowalski raised the mirror instinctively. A Panzer IV emerged from behind a hedgerow, roughly 300 yards away. Perfect mirror range, close enough to kill or be killed. The Panzer stopped, angled slightly, turret turning. Kowalski angled the mirror, watching the reflection settle into view. The hull appeared clearly. The driver's viewport sat exactly where he expected it. Everything looked right. He fired. The shell missed, not by inches but by yards. It struck the ground 20 feet to the left of the Panzer, throwing dirt and smoke into the air. The German tank fired back instantly. The shell slammed into Bad News's front armor, penetrating several inches before losing momentum. The tank lurched violently. Kowalski's head slammed into the gun sight. Blood ran from his nose. "What the hell was that?" Carson shouted. Kowalski didn't answer. He didn't understand. He fired again. Another miss, this time to the right. The Panzer remained stationary, its crew confident now, lining up a killing shot. At this range, Kowalski should not have been missing. Yesterday, he had hit moving targets under worse conditions. Now he couldn't hit a tank sitting still. He adjusted the mirror angle and fired a third time. The shell fell short by 50 yards, skipping across the ground. The Panzer advanced, 250 yards, close enough to see the German commander's head protruding from the hatch. Close enough to die. 2 other Shermans opened fire. Both hit. The Panzer shuddered. Black smoke pouring from the engine deck. The crew bailed out, sprinting for cover. Kowalski sat frozen. His hands shook, not from fear but confusion. Why hadn't the mirror worked? Then he looked at it closely. Not a quick glance. A real look. The crack had widened overnight. The 2 halves of the mirror were no longer aligned. They reflected 2 slightly different images, separated by just enough to destroy accuracy. His crosshairs lined up with one reflection, while the actual target sat in the other. His aim had been split. He wrapped adhesive tape tightly around the mirror's edges, forcing the glass halves back together. The double image softened, merged imperfectly. He tested it on a tree stump 400 yards out. The shot landed 2 feet left. Better, but not good enough. The problem wasn't training. It was physics. A cracked mirror didn't reflect one truth. It reflected many. Kowalski radioed the others. "Check your mirrors. Any cracks? Replace them now." 3 tanks reported the same issue. 2 admitted they had already noticed strange misses. They hadn't connected the cause. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams acted immediately. New orders went out. Inspect mirrors before every engagement. Loaders carried backups. Chip or flaw. Commanders carried spares. But mirrors were glass. Glass breaks. Inside a tank, glass doesn't last long. Recoil shook turrets violently. Spent casings slammed into walls. Dust and smoke coated everything. Even perfectly mounted mirrors cracked within days. Some crews experimented with polished steel mirrors, stronger, unbreakable. But the reflections were dim and blurry, good enough to see shapes, not precise enough to hit weak points. Others tried acrylic mirrors. Durable, light, but gunsmoke scratched the surface until the reflection became useless. Glass remained the best option, and the most dangerous, because the Germans were watching. They noticed hands raised near periscopes. They noticed flashes of reflected sunlight. They noticed which Shermans were suddenly deadly at close range. And they adapted. German gunners began aiming high. They stopped targeting hulls. They targeted turrets. They targeted periscopes. They targeted loaders. At 10:15 a.m. on September 20th, Private Ray Hollis raised his mirror during an engagement at 350 yards. The Panzer fired not at center mass, but at the periscope. The shell struck 6 inches above it. The turret roof peeled open. Hollis died instantly. So did his commander. By afternoon it happened again. 4th Armored understood the truth. The mirror that saved them was now marking them. By the 3rd day, the mirror technique was no longer a secret weapon. It was a calculated risk. Use it and survive, or raise it and become a target. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams gathered his commanders again. The mood was grim, sober, stripped of the optimism they'd felt days earlier. The Germans know, Abrams said. They're looking for mirrors. The question wasn't whether to stop using them. It was whether to die blind or die trying. The decision was brutal but simple. They would keep using mirrors, but only when absolutely necessary. No early exposure, no unnecessary movement. Raise it, aim fast, fire, lower it, adapt, or die. For 3 more days, 4th Armored fought that way. The kill ratio wasn't as miraculous as before, but it was better than anything they'd had before the mirror existed. 41 German tanks destroyed, 19 Shermans lost. Then the battle ended. The Germans withdrew. Patton advanced east. The mirror technique faded quietly into memory. It never entered training manuals, never became doctrine, never received official recognition. It remained a field-expedient solution, effective, fragile, and temporary. Eddie Kowalski survived the war. He kept the mirror, cracked, taped, clouded. He brought it home to Pittsburgh in November 1945 and put it in a shoebox in his basement. He didn't display it, didn't tell stories about it, didn't think anyone would care. He was right, not until decades later. In the 1970s, a historian found Lieutenant Carson's after-action report buried deep in the National Archives. It described mirror-assisted gunnery in detail. Statistics, diagrams, witness accounts. The numbers were undeniable. 4th Armored had achieved the highest tank kill ratio of any American armored division during that period. The report had been ignored, filed, forgotten. The historian tracked down surviving tankers. Kowalski was one of them. When asked why the technique never became standard, he answered simply, because it was stupid, a bathroom mirror. Nobody wants to admit soldiers had to fix their equipment with shaving gear. Kowalski died in 1994. His son cleaned out the basement. He found the shoebox. He threw the mirror away. The mirror that killed 3 Panzers in 4 minutes ended its life in a landfill. But the story didn't die. It resurfaced in books, articles, documentaries, not because of the glass, because of what it represented. Improvisation under fire. Problem-solving when seconds meant life or death. A loader who refused to accept that the dead zone was unavoidable. The dead zone still exists in modern warfare, in different forms, under different names. Technology evolves. Geometry doesn't. What Eddie Kowalski proved wasn't how to aim a tank. He proved that innovation doesn't wait for permission. It happens when someone notices what everyone else ignores. A broken mirror, a desperate moment, a refusal to die. 4 minutes, 3 Panzers, 1 piece of glass. Sometimes, that's enough to change history. The bomber limped toward friendly skies, its once pristine fuselage now scorched and battered. Smoke drifted from the port wing, curling upward in dark, angry streaks that caught the early morning sun. The crew moved like shadows inside the cabin, every action precise, almost automatic. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them, yet adrenaline refused to let them collapse. Outside, the world was eerily quiet. No enemy fighters dared to approach, but that silence carried its own menace. It was the calm that followed chaos, the moment when the mind realizes just how close it came to dying. The navigator peered through the cracked plexiglass, plotting the safest course back to base. Every hill, every valley, every patch of forest below was a reminder of where they had been and what they had survived. The pilot adjusted the throttles, fighting the drag of a wounded engine. Sparks flew from the damaged wingtip as it scraped through the clouds. The tail gunner checked his ammo for the last time, fingers trembling slightly, aware that one misstep could mean the end. No one spoke. Words had already been spent, and silence carried more meaning than any conversation could. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly as the bomber crossed miles of scarred countryside. Fields that had once been peaceful were now cratered and blackened, rivers streaked with debris, roads littered with destroyed vehicles. Each sight was a reminder of the war they had flown through, each shadow a ghost of what had been lost. Then, finally, the base came into view, a small strip of tarmac, surrounded by sandbags and anti-aircraft emplacements, stood like a fragile promise of safety. The crew tightened their harnesses, braced for landing, hearts hammering in unison. The engines roared and strained as the pilot guided the bomber down, each second testing the limits of the damaged aircraft. Flak bursts erupted nearby from friendly defenses, mistaking the damaged bomber for a threat. Shouts echoed inside the cabin. The engineer leaned over, cutting wires and flipping switches to avoid ignition hazards. The tail gunner prayed silently, clutching the framework of his turret. Then finally, wheels touched the runway. A violent jolt threw men against straps and walls. The bomber skidded, groaning under the weight of its injuries, but it stayed upright. Cheers and relieved laughter broke out inside, mingled with tears of exhaustion and disbelief. They had survived. The war was not over. They knew it would continue. But for this flight, this mission, this moment, against overwhelming odds, they had won. And as the smoke cleared and the sun rose fully, they realized the fragile miracle they had lived through, the courage, the sacrifice, and the relentless will to keep flying when death seemed inevitable. Somewhere deep in the wreckage of war, amidst the fire and chaos, the bomber had become more than metal. It was a testament, a monument to survival, to every soldier who refused to give up. The long road home had finally ended, for now.